Hello and welcome to our special episode on the recently concluded United Nations Summit of the Future. We will be discussing the Pact of the Future and the process that led us to this point from a human rights lens. My name is Madua Mahlachi, Communications and Media Relations Manager at Outright International. I'm joined by my colleagues who've been following the various events leading up to this summit at the UN General Assembly. And let me take this opportunity to congratulate these colleagues of mine who've done a wonderful job. Another successful co-hosting of the UN LGBTI Core Group High Level Week event that took place here in New York. So shout out to the whole team, but let's introduce you to the listeners out there. We'll start with you, Ophelia.
Hi, my name is Ophelia Kemigisha. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Uganda, Kampala. I currently live in New York. I work at Outright as a UN program officer, and it's a great honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Kohn. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in New York, but I grew up in London and Hong Kong. I am also a UN program officer at Outright International, where I get the pleasure of working with Ophelia every day.
Amazing. And a special shout out to our technical producer, Hazel, who's here with us. But now let's dive right straight into it. Now, the Summit of the Future has come and gone, and I'd like to get your reaction on some of the outcomes of this Future Pact. But before that, this podcast is going to appear on some Google search for a young person and trying to figure out what this summit was all about and how it affected their lives. So, Ophelia and Hannah, I think we'll start with you, Ophelia. Can I ask you to take this one and just give us some kind of an explanation of what Summit of the Future is and what is it for?
It's a great question that I've also been asking a lot. What is the Summit of the Future? So the Summit of the Future came from the Secretary General, the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. So after the pandemic and the mess that there was the pandemic where we had economies all over the world flailing, people lost their jobs, people lost, just there was this general sense around the world that things were pretty bad. And so the Secretary General said we need to really rethink everything. And so he wrote a report called Our Common Agenda. And basically, he said to member states, what are we going to do about this? Like, what are we going to do about climate change? What are we going to do about war? What are we going to do about pandemics? We really need to think about how to re-evaluate and restart those systems that we've had in place for a long time that haven't been working. Because if they had been working, maybe we wouldn't be in this crisis. And so he wrote a report called Our Common Agenda, and then they decided to create this process called the Summit of the Future. And it was conceived as a consultative process. So it's been going on for about 18 months now. And they've been having multiple conversations. So specific governments based here in New York decided to take the lead on negotiating this document. And unlike, Hannah will know more about this, but usually the documents kind of come pre-written, and then governments look at them and say, I don't know what this one means. I don't know if I want my country to agree to this, because basically international law is based on governments kind of negotiating between themselves, like what's possible, what are their responsibilities. This is the place where they negotiate their relationship at a global stage. And so this document was different in the sense that it was actually written from scratch. So they said, what do you want to see in this pact? Based on all the issues that I've written out, what do you want to see in this pact? And everybody, civil society, governments all came with all these ideas. And then specific governments were put in charge of looking at the documents. So you mentioned the Pact for the Future. There are actually 3 documents. At least we've been working with 3 documents. Now it's 1. But
you guys read all of these?
Yes, we do. And they're actually really interesting. I highly recommend that people go and read these documents because it's a bit intimidating, to be honest. The first time I opened these documents, I was like, I don't know what any of this is. And they are really long. But they are about everyday things, right? So the Pact for the Future is about multilateralism in general. How are governments going to work together to solve the problems of the world? There's one called the Declaration for Future Generations, and it's about a future long-term thinking. When we think about the future, what kind of things do we need to put in place to make sure that there is a future, that this species survives, and that we have a world to give to our people after after we go away. The Global Digital Compact is about our lives online and our lives with technology. How do we negotiate the different people who are involved, the users, the companies, the governments, who decides what goes on the internet, what happens with AI. So kind of all these big issues that governments are grappling with, this was the space for them to grapple with them together as a group. And of course, that means that us, the rest of us who are all over the world, we are interested to know what our governments are agreeing to. If you look at the summit, the Pact for the Future, the very first sentence says, we, the governments of the world, on behalf of the people, representing the people. So they're doing it on our behalf. So it's definitely our business. I hope that's helpful. That's kind of the process that led us here.
Yeah, well, I think if I was that young person who was Google searching it, I would be on some, But Hannah, I'm sure you have something to add to it.
I mean, Ophelia beautifully covered kind of all of the main points of the Summit of the Future and how it came about. What I will just add is that the Summit of the Future was also conceived as a way to make the UN fit for purpose today. Because the UN was created after World War II, when the world was reeling from that horrific, disastrous war and wanted to make sure it never happened again. And they structured the UN based on the geopolitics of the time. And in many ways, that's just not working anymore. And Summit of the Future, it's about all of our common futures, broadly in the world in all the ways that Ophelia was talking about, but it's also about a different future for the UN itself. And I think we can talk about how effective that is and what needs to happen and whether we're doing that or not. But I think that is an important question that was at the heart of the Summit of the Future.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Hazel is nodding, so it means this is making so much sense for everybody else who's listening out there. And let me take you a little bit back to something you wrote, or you were interviewed, Ophelia, rather, and I read it was quite compelling and thought-provoking for me when I read your thoughts ahead of the summit, where you spoke about the need for inclusive language in the Pact that reflects and respects the diversity of LGBTIQ people. And it mentioned the importance of LGBTIQ inclusion in areas such as sustainable development, peace and security, technology, youth and future generations, and global governance. Now that the Pact is here, did it meet your expectations? And Hannah, please feel free to add on to Ophelia's points, because, there's a background story that when you're in the corridors of the United Nations, you hear so much about this. But let me hear your thoughts if it met any of your expectations.
Yeah, so, I never used to do UN work before. This is my first time working with the UN. And it's a really interesting experience. So by the time I got involved, like I said, following this Summit of the Future process, it was already, I guess, discussed that LGBTI wasn't going to be in the document, wasn't in the document, and wasn't being mentioned. It's true that LGBTI people have a concern about debt, structure, and peace and security, because of course we live in the world. But there was just a preconceived idea that there is no place for like sexual orientation and gender identity or sex characteristics in this document, which I found quite strange, because I was like, so will LGBT people be in the future, or like are we being left in the past? Like what's so I guess that's my very first reflection, which is that UN processes, just because for some reason the rights of LGBT people have been such a lightning rod, something that divides people so strongly. Member states, for this document, one of the process things that they put in place is that member states all had to agree. So every single member state, all 193 of them had to agree to all the language in there. And they knew, the people who were negotiating this document immediately knew that this was an issue they couldn't even bring up, because they knew that people would not, that it would automatically, it would really hamper the chances of the document even being agreed to, right? So it was like, if we want people to agree, we need to bring things that are like kind of in the middle. So that alone, I think, is something to be concerned about. So it's strange, like, to have a document that says the pact for the future, but as if LGBT people aren't in the future and in the future generations and not in the digital world, as if we are not, involved in sustainable development or all those things. But anyway, in any case, the things that we managed to, we still engaged with the document, and we worked a lot with feminist groups. We worked a lot with the LGBTI stakeholder group, which were activists from all over the world, to say, okay, so what are the things that we are interested in seeing in this document? And at some level, some of our expectations were met. There was a point in time, people who were in New York had so much fun during this time because there were so many versions of this document. Like, they would say, this is now revision 3. Then the co-facilitators would send the document out. Then they would send out a call and say, if people want to make comments, we're having a virtual consultation on this day. And then we would call in and would be like, thanks so much for the document. This is nice, but can you please add human rights here? Can you please add this practice here? I remember I was on a call once where someone on the call said, when we write about harmful practices, we should include conversion therapies. So there were many discussions that were had about different things that people were concerned about. And in the end, many of them didn't make it to the document, but some did. So we still have good language around gender, around the inclusion of women and girls. We have good language around making sure that technology and science are inclusive of women and girls, but also of young people. There was really good conversations about mental health that made it to the document. There were issues like universal healthcare, which is, I think, a thing that LGBT people everywhere should be concerned about, made it to the document. There were references to just the possibility of engaging in advocacy at the UN, which is really important because LGBT people, can make a lot of progress in some of these spaces. They may not be able to make nationally. So any space for that in the document is a good thing. There were things about technology-assisted violence, both for all, and they said like vulnerable groups. We don't know what that means, but we can say that's us. There was language around like social protection. There was language around ending racism, xenophobia, and intolerance. So, there are things in there that we can be like, I think they mean us. But it's, it hurts a bit to be like, okay, so you guys really don't want us in the future for real. So that's where we are right now.
Hannah, how do you feel about it?
Oh, we fixed it. We solved it. The world peace. We're disbanding the UN. It solved it all. We're done. Ophelia is completely right about everything. Okay, so for people listening who might not know this, LGBTIQ issues at the UN is incredibly controversial. I would say it is one of the most controversial and divisive topics among member states. There are member states who are great at advocating for LGBTIQ inclusive language, and there are member states who will do everything in their power to prevent it getting in. So in practice, what that means is that if you end up having language on LGBTIQ people or on sexual orientation and gender identity, it generally gets there through a vote. And at the UN, the preference and the default is to do things through consensus, because that's what we want, right? We want the UN to be somewhere that member states come to agree on a way forward. So there's a hard preference not to go to a vote. If you want LGBTIQ in there, it's going to go to a vote, and we follow these processes carefully. In fact, I'm gearing up for a General Assembly session in which I kind of feel pretty comfortable gazing into my crystal ball and saying that in a resolution with a reference to sexual orientation, gender identity, there will be a vote. I could probably tell you the voting lines exactly because they're so predictable. So this is what we go into Summit of the Future with. And it was, as Ophelia said, this was conceived as this really important document that had to be passed by consensus because it had to be something that all the member states of the UN said, this is how we are forging a path forward for the future. And I think that is a large reason why it was thought it was sort of a foregone conclusion that we wouldn't get LGBTI language in there. That being said, I remember in a very early draft, I think it was Argentina, tried to introduce a reference to LGBTI people. So, you know, I'm pretty sure everyone knew it was going to get taken out, but I did appreciate that they tried. You know, like just shout out to our friends who try anyway. I agree with Ophelia that while we don't have explicit references to sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, there is language in this pact that we can interpret. I think not just interpret, I think just does cover LGBTI people. So, for instance, in the section on, there's a section on international peace and security. And in that section, it talks about protection for civilians in conflict. And it says something along the lines of, we need to protect civilians in conflict, including women, girls, people with disabilities, and like other vulnerable groups. And as Ophelia said, like we can make the argument with other vulnerable groups. Also,
I immediately think of our humanitarian report that we just released, talking about how LGBTQ people are vulnerable during crises and humanitarian crises, especially. So I tend to agree. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I completely agree with you. I'm glad you interrupted. Exactly. We know that LGBTIQ people are particularly vulnerable in conflict and crisis. So we can, and I think will, be using that language to further our advocacy. So all is not lost just because we don't have a specific reference. That being said, it would be lovely to have a specific reference, and I agree with Ophelia in that it's frustrating and painful to see so many member states scoff at the very idea of including our communities in this document that is supposed to be about our common future together. Like, honestly, it's such a shame, and it's done so impersonally. And I think in the halls of the UN in New York, people can tell themselves that this isn't really about people. This is about some kind of cultural a cultural argument or a religious argument or opinions, and it's abstracted away from the realities. And we see the realities, and we know the harm that this does, and that's not unique to the Pact of the Future. It's a problem at the UN writ large.
Well, if you just walked into this conversation, you are listening to the Outright Proud podcast, and we are doing a debrief of the Future Pact. And I have with me my colleagues Ophelia and Hannah and Hazel, who's our technical producer. Thank you so much. And now that we're here and we have not been mentioned as a community, I'll say, in your line of work, maybe how do you plan to leverage the outcomes and maybe even the momentum from the summit of the future to further advance the rights and inclusion of LGBTIQ individuals on a global scale? For example, I mean, you were clearly hoping for a Ferrari, and all you got was a horse and a carriage. So what now?
Not a Ferrari from the UN. That's so funny. I can start. So I think that. So first of all, I have to start by saying that the Pact for the Future is not great for the straights either. Like, it's not like, to be honest, I mean, very few of us won. Like, I think
straights out there, we see you too.
Yeah, and so, I love straight people. Some of my closest friends are straight, so that's not the point. But it's not
I
the
have a brother who's straight.
Oh my God, me too. But it's not that the Pact was. I mean, for all the ways that it was. I mean, hear the name, Summit of the Future. Like, it sounded so epic and so iconic. Like, I was like, this is it. This is really what's going to fix everything. And that the mood over the last few days has just been really disappointed. People are just like, I guess, sure, we can have that. So it wasn't as far-reaching and as ambitious and as kind of structure changing. There are some of these like deeply rooted beliefs and systems that pretty much stayed in place even with this. That being said, I think the main value that this document brings is that it brought every single thing that I guess was at the UN's on the UN's mind at the time, but also is on our minds into one place. So Hannah and I, like, we do different work usually day to day. Like, I really focus on the development work, on thinking about how LGBT people are included in economies, and think about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are these 30 goals that were also a big process many years ago and was supposed to achieve them by 2030. So some people call it the 2030 agenda. In case you're wondering, we're also doing really poorly. We're here in July. They said we're at maybe 17%, if that. It's not looking good. Some places have gone back.
I don't know what you're talking about. I know that, like, gender equality, we achieved that. That's one of the goals.
Please do not listen to Hannah's misinformation on this. We have not achieved gender equality. But there were these really, like, there were these very, before the Summit of the Future, we had the Sustainable Development Goals. They were these very ambitious. They said by 2030, we must have reduced carbon emissions by this much. We must have healthcare at this level. We must have women and men must be equal. We must have this much, all these things. And we are not doing well. But the point I was trying to make is that, so that's the work that I focus on the day-to-day, but Hannah focuses more on peace and security work, and some of our other team members focus more on the women's rights work. So we have these different pots. But the Summit of the Future, it brings at least the Pact for the Future brings all the main things that the UN is about: sustainable development, human rights, and peace and security into one place. And I think that the value there is that we can start to really think of ourselves as part of this larger structure, and also to see the connections between the three things, and we can kind of tackle them in a different way. So I think that's the main value that I see from this document, is that we are able to see our issues in the broader scheme of things, and we can also see, like, new opportunities for allyship, for where we can say, you also want to see Security Council reform just because you're Africa and you've been left out of the Security Council for a long time. And we also want Security Council reform because we think that it hasn't been expansive enough to cover the rights of LGBT people. So how can we work together and make that happen? We want to see debt relief for this and these countries, for poverty alleviation and things like that. Or we want to see small island and developing states like in the Caribbean, which are being affected by huge climate disasters. We want to see them get more money to address those problems. Queer people live there. They are going to be affected in an emergency. So we can see ourselves as part of that larger movement. So I think that's the value that I got from this, and I think that will inform how we think about our issues and will inform kind of the advocacy strategies that we take on from this point onwards. I'm not really sold on the language in here, but to be fair, it's 65 pages. It came out a few days ago. So maybe with some deep reading, I'll be able to be like, they meant LGBT here. But right now, I'm not there yet.
I think the point you made about the connection of the peace and security agenda and the human rights agenda and the sustainable development agenda is really crucial. And I actually believe very early on in the Pact, I think it explicitly talks about those three agendas and says that they are equal and interdependent, and you can't have one without the other. So I totally agree. I think that's a really useful takeaway.
Okay, let's take this conversation a bit forward. Hazel and I were brainstorming this podcast episode, and we're talking about a lot of ideas, and they said something interesting about the use of UN language, or political speak, as I always call it, that sometimes dominates rhetoric and narratives. And we saw some of it in the promotion of this Future Pact. I think this is the perfect time to have that discussion with both of you and tell us exactly what do they mean. Like, one phrase I remember coming to mind was leaving no one behind. That it was actually used a lot in the UN LGBTIQ group that we were in. Enlighten us on how we use this language to advance the work that we do, to our advantage, basically.
I'll jump in. Sometimes when you read a UN document and it starts with something along the lines of, we commit to encourage member states to consider a line of action for future review, and you just want to rip your hair out.
I almost fell asleep just now.
Right. It's like, good God, like, get an editor. And look, some of that is deliberately making language vague enough that 193 different governments can agree on it, and it can pass via consensus. I think that's just a reality. I don't mean to... Maybe I do mean to sound skeptical, but that's just a part of it. However, there are some phrases that, as you've noted, we see again and again, and we find ways to work with them and use them. And they are broader than saying, for instance, LGBTIQ or sexual orientation and gender identity, but they're still advantageous, and sometimes their broadness can even be a little helpful. In all their diversity, so we see in a number of different texts the phrase women and girls in all their diversity. What that allows us to do, and the reason that's there, is it's an acknowledgement that women and girls have many different identities, and we need to make sure we include all women and girls in all of their, different identities, be that race, be that disability, be that national origin, be that sexual orientation and gender identity. We need them all to be included in whatever this text is purporting to do. So, sure, it doesn't say LGBTI, but in a way I like it because we can bring along a much wider group of people with that. And, none of us are just LGBTI. We all occupy different identities, and we work in coalition with lots of different movements, and they're our partners and our allies, and this is a way that we can advocate for language that covers us all. Another phrase that is similarly broad and inclusive that we see is multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. In fact, when diplomats talk about it and they're trying to be cool, they say MIFD, multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination.
Yeah.
And again, we're getting... Hazel's having a breakdown. Our mysterious producer over there is crying. That gets at intersectionality, and intersectionality is a term that was coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how she was speaking particularly about Black women in the United States, how their identities were not fully captured by either race or by gender. And Ophelia and I geek out about this, and feel free to jump on and say more about Crenshaw.
Or do you want me to start talking about Patricia Hill Collins as well, because we can?
Oh, you got to talk about Patricia Hill Collins.
I think Matuba will throw us out.
Oh, that's a good point. We've been told to keep this under 40 minutes, so
we'll follow the rules. But
we'll have to make a separate podcast on women's and gender studies.
You've taken over this podcast.
Yeah. No, this is no longer what we're taking over the ship.
Yeah, please go ahead. Finish with the multiple intersecting forms, and I'll talk about leaving no one behind. Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. We can bring much wider coalitions along with that language, and we can advocate for that language with those coalitions, which makes it more likely to pass. Sometimes in this advocacy, I think member states and sometimes civil society fall into this trap of saying, last year in this document, we got multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination 9 times, and now we only have it 5 times, and therefore we're backtracking. And look, there is a point to that. I think it's much more important to have that language in the most strategic places. If you say it once in a place where it's kind of more of a commitment, I prefer that a lot more than having it 9 times in paragraphs that don't really do much operationally. So I think there's also strategy around how we use this language. Do you want to take leaving no one behind?
Yeah. So thanks, Hannah. I actually just learned a lot from listening to Hannah just now. But leaving no one behind is... So it was like a premise that was put at the heart of the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals that I was talking about earlier. A big kind of point of contention, or that maybe not contention, but a point that came out very strongly by the end of that process was that if you want sustainable development, all of us have to participate. Like, we're not going to have a world where one country is developed and the other one isn't. Usually, if it's developed on this side, it's at the cost of the other one. And so you need to kind of, if you want to have, like, for example, if you're tackling a problem like climate change, if you don't really look at the places where climate change is worse, none of us is going to have a livable planet. So that was kind of at the heart of it. And, because it was a development agenda, so it was a lot about, ending poverty, ending hunger. And that's why they were like, we need to find the people who are the most behind and work with them so that no one is left behind. But it's a really compelling image of leaving no one behind, because we know that LGBT communities are often left behind. And so we find that compelling. So when a country says, we have done this much, we've given this many people jobs, and we've done this, and then we are like, yeah, but you also passed a law that says it's illegal to be gay, which means these people don't get jobs, which means you're leaving those people behind. And so leaving no one behind is just like a clarion call that helps us to say, yeah, and because the reason we love it is because all the governments agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. All of them sat down. They were like, this is it. We are happy with this agenda. We are all on this agenda. And every July, they come here and they make reports about how far they've gone, and they say how they are doing. So it's a really easy place for us to be like, you said you'd leave no one behind. What about us?
Interesting. We're nearing the end of our podcast, which I've enjoyed thoroughly, and I'm learning a lot myself. Because I always say, okay,
He's trying to end it because we're taking it over.
Yeah, that too. But then I want to invoke some of the work that we've done here at Outright International. The humanitarian report, crisis report, the Pride report, the annual Pride report that we do, conversion practices report that we recently released, and the Glide landscape analysis report. And the one thing these documents have in common is pointing out that LGBTIQ people are under siege in many different ways. And yes, the reports also show that there are opportunities and sometimes breakthroughs for LGBTIQ people. But with member states of the UN culpable for some of these challenges queer communities face, can we convince the young crop of queer people or just queer communities around the world that we serve, that the United Nations is actually effective?
Can we? So I think that if we decide to take the future thinking of the Pact, then yes, the United Nations can be effective in the future. Because the main advantage that the UN has is that it's the UN, they already have brand. Everybody knows what the UN is, Even if they don't know what they do every day, they're like, yeah, there's a group over there. They're supposed to be in charge at some level. Also, it's a consensus place. It's a place where you're supposed to go and agree. You're supposed to negotiate and find some kind of middle ground. So if we know from the pandemic, when we realized that viruses don't know borders, we know that we are all connected and we are all, regardless of whatever we name our small piece of land, we are same guy. We are all in the same boat. I think that it can be effective, but the thing is the UN doesn't work unless we do. We actually have to go there and agitate and press and push. And that's not to say that it's the only place to do it, because of course we are fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts. You've talked about so many different places, and all these places people are working at national level, regional level, trying to change a small part. But I think that it's worth our time and our energy to engage at that level, if not for any reason, for the record to show that we fought for ourselves in every battle, every battlefield that we could find, we fought for ourselves there. And whether or not it's effective will depend on, how the fight goes. And then hopefully in a few years, because, Hannah can say more about this, but there was a time when you couldn't even say the word LGBT in the UN. And, yesterday we were in the UN, Dr. Jill Biden is up there queer individuals. And what? There are people, activists from all over the world sitting in a room talking about it was taboo. But people had to fight for that space. So I think it's a fight that's ongoing. And I think that it would actually be good for the UN to be more inclusive. And I think that that's worth, at least we should try and see if it happens. So I would like to see it happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the challenges of working at the UN is it is not immediately satisfying. It is slow. And if you kind of working there every day, it can be frustrating because you're kind of asking again and again and trying really hard to do something. And, again and again, it's not happening. However, if you take a long-term view, you can see there's been huge change, which you were getting at, Ophelia. I mean, not long ago, if you look at historic documents at the UN, I think you would not find a single reference to LGBTI people or to sexual orientation and gender identity until very recently. But now you do see it in documents, and you see it increasingly in more documents. And it is in conversations, heated conversations, but they are having conversations. That's huge in and of itself. And I think actually something that's, and I should also mention it's now there are General Assembly resolutions that mention sexual orientation and gender identity. That hadn't happened before. There have been 2 informal meetings and 1 formal meeting at the Security Council in which they talked about LGBTI people. That's huge. There's progress. One way that I see progress very recently, actually, is the UN launching its UN-wide LGBTIQ+, I believe that's how they say it, strategy. This is something that we've been waiting for years, and there's been a lot of advocacy to try to get out. And it finally came out a few months ago. So it is a strategy that applies to the UN Secretariat, which for people who aren't UN dorks, or aren't UN dorks yet, the Secretariat kind of runs the operations of the UN, and the Secretary General is
it's like their head office, sort of, like their main.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
He runs the Secretariat. So now everyone in the Secretariat needs to follow the strategy, and UN agencies, so that's like UN Women or the UN Development Program, can opt in. And it's not a very long strategy, but it has actions both internally and externally that people have to follow. So internally, like the UN as a workplace, how they're treating their queer employees, and externally in terms of programming with others, making sure there's LGBTI inclusive programming and that LGBT people are at the table when decisions are being made that affect them. So that's actually really massive. Like, that's coming from the top of the UN. That's coming from the Secretary General. That's major progress. So if you take the long-term view, we are going in the direction that we need to be going. There's a lot of hope to be had. And quite frankly, I think there's a lot of value in having a place where all 193 governments do come and talk to each other. And they really do. Like, you see diplomats from countries that are in the news just, like, really, like, sometimes literally at war with each other, talking. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean those conversations are working at the pace we need them to. But it's a space we have for those conversations to happen. And I think that in and of itself makes it more likely that we will have peaceful resolution and to conflicts, and that we can get things done.
Amazing. Thank you. This is a very insightful conversation. And this is so unscripted, and I didn't plan to ask this question. You both have 30 seconds if you have an answer to the question. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is at the end of his term. Do you have thoughts of who should take over?
A woman. That's my answer. It should be a woman.
It should be a woman.
There has never been... How can there never have been a Secretary General who is a woman? I think that's unconscionable. And I think it should be Hannah, but
I was about to say it should be Ophelia. You beat me to it. No, I'm good. Yeah, I agree. It should be a woman. Also, it should be someone who we think will be braver in their leadership on the issue of LGBTI people's rights. The current Secretary General, sure, published the strategy. That's huge, but there's been very little public kind of a lot of like private behind closed
We
doors.
have to talk about that, but I'm sure we'll get
yeah.
to it.
So a woman who cares about us.
Yeah.
We should be able to find one of those somewhere in the world,
I think
right?
that's a good.
I have some names. I'm going to write to the UN and tell them, give Hannah Kohn this job.
Oh my God.
Well, that brings us to the end of our Outright Proud podcast. And this is a collaboration between the UN team here at Outright International and the communications team. Thank you to Ophelia, Hannah, and Hazel. I really appreciate you guys, and it's lovely to work with you. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Let's continue to work together for better LGBTIQ lives outright. If you're interested in the work we do at the United Nations, please go to outrightinternational.org for more.